All right, welcome back to the deep dive. So, for today's deep dive, we're going to be looking at a podcast script all about mastering small talk in English.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it should be pretty interesting. And, we get a lot of requests to cover this kind of communication skill. And,
I bet, yeah.
yeah, so, I think we can really help our listeners out with this one.
Yeah.
So, our mission today is really to help you, our listeners, to be able to navigate those initial social interactions, with grace and confidence,
Yeah.
turning those what could be really awkward silences
Yeah.
into, genuine connections.
It's amazing, isn't it, how so much emphasis is placed on, this small talk.
Yeah, for sure.
Like we think about making connections and deeper conversations,
Uh-huh.
but this source really highlighted that small talk is kind of like the social glue.
It is, yeah,
It sort of binds us together initially and allows for deeper relationships to develop,
for sure, yeah,
personally and professionally.
absolutely. It's interesting, too, thinking about it from a cultural perspective. Yeah. Because the source did mention that, in many English-speaking cultures, kind of jumping straight into business
Right.
or, more kind of serious or deeper topics without that initial kind of light banter
Right.
can be perceived pretty negatively
Oh, yeah.
as, being standoffish or even rude.
Uh-huh.
You think you're being efficient, right? You're like,
Right.
oh, let's just get down to business.
Right, yeah.
But, unknowingly, you might be creating this barrier.
Yeah, definitely.
And I thought this was really interesting that the source pointed out that something like 80% of networking success
Wow.
isn't about those formal pitches,
Right.
but about those connections you make through casual conversations.
Wow, that is huge.
So it just goes to show how important it is.
Yeah, it really does.
And then I thought this was a kind of a funny little fact that they included, that the average British person, they spend 6 months of their life
What?
talking about the weather.
That's crazy.
Oh.
Just talking about the weather.
Yeah, that was their fun fact.
Wow, that's wild.
It is pretty wild. But,
That's a lot of small talk.
it is, yeah. But it kind of speaks to how,
It's ingrained, right?
yeah, ingrained and how, we don't need these kind of, these skills.
Yeah, for sure.
Because, the weather is kind of the universal,
Right.
safe starting point, I think.
It is. Everybody, you can always talk about the weather.
Ah, for sure. So let's get into some actual strategies that the source gave
Okay, great.
that we can all use. And they introduced this thing called the golden formula for stress-free small talk,
Okay.
which they break down into 3 steps,
Okay.
which is anchor, share, ask.
Anchor, share, ask. Got it.
Okay, so
Anchor.
anchor, it might feel a little like, we're getting a little too structured here.
Yeah,
But, sometimes having these kind of like frameworks
sure.
really helps.
It does, yeah.
And especially when you're feeling a little bit like you're not sure how to initiate or keep a conversation going.
Right. It's good to have a roadmap.
It is, it is. So with the anchor, you're basically making a comment about something that you and the other person are experiencing at that moment.
Okay.
So it could be at the event
Uh-huh.
that you're at or about the location.
Right.
Maybe you're, in a really beautiful park or something.
Yeah.
Or it could just be the general situation.
Right.
Like if you're waiting in a really long line or something.
Right, yeah.
Right. So the example that they gave was like, let's say you're at a venue
Uh-huh.
and you notice the artwork.
Okay.
You could just say something simple like,
Yeah.
this venue has such cool artwork.
Right.
Right. Because you're both in the same space, observing the same thing.
Right.
So you're immediately establishing this kind of common ground.
That's true, yeah. You're both experiencing that same reality.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so then we move on to the share step. This is where you add in a little personal detail
Okay.
to make sure it's relatable.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So you're connecting it to the anchor,
Yeah.
but you don't want to
Oh, for sure.
overshare. Right.
Right.
You don't want to make the other person feel uncomfortable.
All right, yeah.
You want to just offer like a little glimpse into your world.
Yeah.
So using our example of the artwork,
Uh-huh.
you could say something like, oh, it reminds me of a gallery I visited in London.
Oh, nice.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the final step is ask.
Okay.
And this is where you pose an open-ended question
Right.
to keep the conversation flowing.
Okay.
So, rather than just
Yeah.
asking something that they can answer yes or no to.
Right.
So with our artwork example, you could say something like, do you enjoy modern art?
Right.
And then that kind of invites them to
Elaborate.
elaborate, yeah,
Yeah.
and tell you a little bit more about themselves.
Yeah, that open-endedness makes them feel like you're interested
Yeah, for sure.
in what they have to say.
Absolutely. So that's the anchor, share, ask method.
I like that.
Now, they also gave this other really great tip or tool, I guess,
Okay.
which is to think about the acronym F or D.
4D.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is really helpful if you're finding yourself
Yeah.
in a situation where you just can't think of
Right.
what to talk about.
Okay.
Right. What to use as your anchor.
Yeah.
So the F stands for family.
Oh, okay.
And now they do caution. This doesn't mean
Yeah.
launching into your entire family history.
Right.
Right.
Keep it light.
But it could be something like, oh, any fun weekend plans with the kids?
Yeah.
Or, how's your family doing? Just keeping it light and casual.
Right.
The O is for occupation.
Okay.
So, again, rather than just saying, what do? You could try something like, what's the most interesting or challenging part of your job right now?
Right.
Just something that's a little more engaging.
Yeah. Or what does a typical day look like for you?
Yeah, exactly.
Something like that.
And then R is for recreation.
Okay.
Which covers all your hobbies and interests, leisure activities.
Right.
So, something like, tried any good restaurants lately?
Yeah.
Or, are you reading any interesting books or watching any good shows?
Yeah, that's a good one.
So that can, if you happen to discover a shared interest there, that's great for future conversations.
Right.
And then finally is D for dreams.
Dreams. Okay.
And this isn't about literal dreams like when you're sleeping.
Right.
More about aspirations
Mm-hmm.
and kind of what they're hoping to achieve. So you could ask something like, if you could travel anywhere in the world next,
Yeah.
where would you go and why?
Right. Right.
So it's really positive.
Yeah, it's positive.
It's future focused,
Uh-huh.
And
kind of taps into people's passions.
Exactly. Okay, so that's FOUD, which are kind of, the do's of small talk topics.
Them topics. Yeah.
So then they give a pro tip
Okay.
on topics to maybe steer clear of,
Right.
especially in those initial chats, which I think is really valuable advice.
Yeah.
And they use the acronym RAPE,
Okay.
which is religion,
Okay.
abortion,
Right.
politics,
Okay.
and economics.
Yeah.
Now, these are areas that can be very sensitive,
Yeah, they can.
potentially divisive, especially when you're just meeting somebody for the first time.
Yeah, for sure.
You haven't built that foundation of trust.
Not yet. No.
So, yeah, good advice there. Okay, so let's say we've started a conversation.
Okay.
We've got it going. We used our anchor,
Uh-huh.
our share,
Yeah.
and our ask.
Yeah.
But now how do we actually keep the conversation flowing
Great.
and avoid just those dead-end responses?
Uh-huh.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Cools.
Right. Yeah, cool. So they give some really actionable strategies for that.
Okay. Yeah.
And they really focus on active listening and using what they call transition phrases.
Okay.
So active listening, it's not just about what you're saying.
Right.
It's about
Listening.
listening, really paying attention
Right. Yeah.
to what the other person is saying
Uh-huh.
and responding in a thoughtful way.
Yeah.
So one tip that they give for active listening is to circle back
Okay.
to something that the person mentioned earlier
Yeah.
and ask a follow-up question.
Uh-huh.
So for example, they say, let's say the person, mentioned that they were learning to play guitar.
Right.
You could say, oh, you mentioned you were learning to play the guitar. How's that going?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Like you remembered.
Exactly. It shows that you're paying attention,
Yeah.
that you're genuinely interested,
Uh-huh.
and it encourages them to elaborate.
It does. Yeah.
Right.
And then they feel heard.
Yeah, exactly. Another good one is to ask open-ended questions
Yeah.
that delves a little deeper into what they've said. So, for example, they say, that's so interesting that you work in that field.
Right.
What initially drew you to it?
Yeah.
Right? So you're showing genuine curiosity.
Yeah.
You're going beyond those kind of surface level details.
Yeah.
And it allows you to really understand their perspective.
For sure. Yeah.
And then there's these things called transition phrases. And these are really like little verbal bridges
Yeah.
that can help you smoothly move from one topic to another.
Okay.
So examples that they gave were, speaking of,
Uh-huh.
whatever topic they just mentioned,
Right.
have you heard about?
Yeah.
Or that reminds me of.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, just really, really simple,
It is simple.
but effective.
Effective. So now, let's say we've had our conversation.
Okay.
We're ready to wrap things up.
Right.
They actually give some nice tips.
Yeah, for how to make a graceful exit.
That can be tricky.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can feel awkward.
Yeah.
So one that they suggest is, saying something like, it's been great chatting with you, and I see someone I need to quickly say hello to. Perhaps we can continue this conversation later.
Right.
So you're acknowledging
Yeah.
the interaction positively.
Uh-huh.
You're giving a clear reason why you're moving on,
Yeah.
and you're suggesting a future connection.
I like that.
So, you're not just
Yeah.
running away.
Right. You're not being rude.
Exactly.
You're being polite.
Okay. Another one is, I need to grab another drink.
Yeah.
But it was lovely meeting you.
Right. Nice.
So again, very clear,
Yeah.
understandable reason,
Yeah.
and a positive closing remark.
Right.
And then a life hack, and I really liked this one,
Okay.
is to try to make a mental note
Okay.
of one unique detail.
Okay. About the person.
And then the next time you see them, bring it up.
Oh, wow.
Right. So let's say
Yeah.
they had mentioned they were going on a hiking trip.
Right.
You could say something like,
Yeah.
how was that hiking trip you were planning?
Yeah, that's great.
It shows that you remember them.
It does, yeah.
You were genuinely interested.
It shows that you were listening.
Exactly.
And you care.
And it can make a really strong positive impression.
It can, yeah.
Right. So all of this takes practice.
Right.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
And they actually suggest a few small talk drills
Okay.
that you can do
Right.
to kind of build your conversational muscle.
Okay.
So one of them is the 30-second challenge,
What's that?
where you set a timer for 30 seconds
Okay.
and you try to concisely describe your day or a hobby
Okay.
within that time limit.
So it helps you be, more concise.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Another one, which I thought was kind of fun,
Okay.
was TV character practice. So when you're watching a show,
Mm-hmm.
you pause it
Okay.
during a conversation
Yeah.
and you try to predict what the character would say next.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is interesting, right?
Yeah.
And then they also have the photo prompt drill.
Okay.
And this one, you just grab a random photo
Okay.
and narrate it as if you're telling a friend about it.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it helps you find kind of interesting details
It does, yeah.
and engage somebody with a visual.
Yeah?
And then their pro tip for all of this is to record yourself
Oh, okay.
doing it
Yeah.
using voice notes.
Yeah.
And then you can listen back and be like, oh, do I sound
Engaged.
engaged and enthusiastic?
Yeah.
Or do I sound kind of monotone and boring?
Yeah, yeah.
So self-awareness is key.
Definitely.
Okay, now, even with all the best preparation,
Right.
awkward moments can still happen.
They do, yeah.
Right.
It's true.
That's just part of life.
Yeah.
And they actually acknowledge this and say, silence happens.
Mm-hmm.
And they give us some strategies to recover.
Okay, good.
So let's say you just completely blank out.
Yeah.
You can say something lighthearted,
Right.
like, oh my gosh, my mind just went totally blank. What were we just talking about?
Yeah.
And laugh it off.
That's a good one.
Yeah, humor can be a great way to diffuse that awkwardness.
Again, yeah.
And then when a topic just seems to fall flat,
Yeah.
you could say something like, maybe that wasn't the most riveting subject.
Right.
Let's switch gears. Have you seen any good movies lately?
I like that.
Right.
Yeah. It's just acknowledging it.
Yeah.
Moving on.
Exactly. And then if you're worried that you might have said something that was,
Yeah.
a little bit of a cultural misstep,
Right.
they suggesting something like, I think I might have just put my foot in my mouth a bit there. Could you help me understand that better?
Yeah, that's a good one.
So you're showing humility, willingness to learn.
Right.
And-
And again, they'll probably appreciate that.
Exactly. So I think, the key takeaway from all of this is that
No.
awkwardness is a universal experience.
It is, yeah.
We've all been there.
Even people who are like, really good at conversation,
Yeah.
they still have those moments.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay, so they end with a listener challenge.
Okay.
And your mission, should you choose to accept it,
Okay.
is to initiate at least one small talk conversation this week.
Good challenge.
It's a good one, right? So maybe it's with the barista
Yeah.
when you get your coffee, or a colleague at work,
Huh.
or a neighbor you see outside.
Yeah.
Try using the anchor, share, ask method.
I like it.
And then just take a moment afterwards to think about what worked, what didn't work.
Yeah.
And you can even share your experiences
Yeah.
using the hashtag small talk win.
Nice.
So they even give a perfect example
Okay.
of what you could say.
So you're in the coffee line.
Yeah.
It's really long.
Mm-hmm.
You could say, oh my gosh, this coffee line is so long today.
Right.
I always seem to come at the peak rush hour.
Right.
Do you have a favorite thing to order here?
Oh, perfect.
Right. So they're using that
Anchor, share, ask.
share ask.
Yeah.
So to kind of, wrap up our deep dive into the art of small talk, just remember that it really is like social stretching.
It is, yeah.
It might feel a little awkward at first,
Yeah.
but, just like with stretching,
Yeah.
the more you do it,
The better you get at it.
the easier it becomes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So every little chat,
Yeah.
even if it's about something as mundane as the weather,
Uh-huh.
it's all a step towards building those deeper, more meaningful connections.
It is. I like that.
And speaking of deeper, more meaningful connections, our next deep dive is going to be into the fascinating world of how to understand English humor and sarcasm.
Oh, fun.
Because as the source cleverly put it,
Yeah.
right, doesn't always mean yes.
That's true. It doesn't. It could mean the opposite.
Exactly.
Or something else entirely.
Exactly. So we'll leave you with a quote to end, which is from the source you sent.
Okay.
Small talk is the appetizer of human connection.
I like that.
Isn't that great?
It is, yeah.
Okay, and a final thought.
Okay.
How might mastering small talk open up unexpected opportunities?